flying. I've never seen that, but we're actually going to have to land somewhere else.
Stranded travelers whose planes are grounded scrambled for rooms in an unintended destination. Across America tonight, malls are closed, blood banks are open, and this woman at a gym in Dallas seems to speak for so many.
Your own home is being attacked, basically. I mean, I feel personal. I feel like it's personal. I really do.
We continue now with a moment-by-moment look at how the attack on America unfolded from correspondent Russ Mitchell. Well, we're obviously having some technical difficulties. That'll happen when you have as much live coverage as we've had today. We don't have an explanation and no apologies. We know that you understand. So we take our coverage in a different direction for the moment. Afghanistan's hardline Taliban leaders condemned the attacks in the United States, but they rejected all suggestions that Osama bin Laden could be behind them. Now, this is the Taliban's side of the story, and they have consistently been saying for years that, in effect, the United States overestimates Osama bin Laden, and it's the Taliban leadership in Afghanistan. This is their story, this is their song, they haven't changed it, and they repeated it again today, that Osama bin Laden could not have been connected to this. We go to Washington and CBS News Chief White House Correspondent John Roberts. John?
Well, certainly, Dan, the administration and the White House believes that there was a connection to Osama bin Laden. Following his Oval Office address tonight, the president went immediately into a meeting of his National Security Council, the Vice President, Colin Powell, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and his National Security Advisor and staff. And they believe that they have good information that there is at least some connection to Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda group, though other sources caution CBS News that connection isn't whole yet, and so do not pursue it too far at this point. But certainly, Dan, there is some pretty good thinking here this evening and this morning that the al-Qaeda group headed by Osama bin Laden is behind this. Now, they're going to leave no investigative trail untouched. They're going to devote the full resources of the FBI, the CIA, the National Security Agency, and as well as the administration toward trying to divine who might be responsible for this. But we had earlier on our air some pictures from Kabul, Afghanistan. This was about 3:30 in the afternoon Pacific time of some explosions occurring at an airport outside of Kabul. Apparently, that was unrelated to this. It was a local problem inside Afghanistan, and the White House, in fact, has denied any involvement in that. But the White House does add tonight, senior administration officials telling CBS News that when it comes time for retaliatory action in this case, the action is going to be decisive and it is going to be punitive. Let's not forget the cruise missile attacks that we saw in both Sudan and Afghanistan following the bombings of the U.S. embassies in Eastern Africa. And that was obviously it was an attack against U.S. soil in other countries and U.S. interests. But Dan, just the scope of this tragedy and the scope of the attacks, which I really believe haven't really sunk in with the American public yet, demands some sort of swift, if not swift action, at least some sort of determined action by the United States. And in fact, let me retract that right away, because the White House says that they want to take their time on this. They're not expecting swift action. They want to make sure that they have all the cards lined up. They want to make sure that they get the trail going right to where it needs to be before they take action. But certainly, Dan, this is going to call, as some people have called this, an act of war against the United States. It is going to be something that demands some very strong action on the part of this country. The problem is, though, and many people have likened this to the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Back then, you knew who the enemy was, and you had a pretty reasonable idea of where the enemy was. The shadowy figures that lurk in the world of terrorism are very difficult to get a firm handle on, Dan. So it may be difficult when it comes time for retaliation to direct it with the pinpoint accuracy that the administration is going to want to direct it with, to make sure that they get who is responsible, and only those who are responsible. But if you look again at the President's Oval Office address, he certainly made a very broad connection between not just the people who were responsible for committing these acts, but people who might have been working with them. The President said very directly, very forthrightly, we will make no distinctions between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. And if it is true that Osama bin Laden is connected with these terrorist attacks, Dan, then that message by the president tonight from the Oval Office was directed straight at the heart of the Taliban leadership in Afghanistan, who have been offering Osama bin Laden safe haven, and the same Taliban who you quoted just a little while ago was saying that they believe that Osama bin Laden had nothing to do with this. The president tonight in his Oval Office address really, Dan, trying to be both resolute and reassuring to the nation, to say that we have suffered a great tragedy, we have suffered a great blow, but this is something that we will recover from. The president went to great lengths to say that tomorrow government offices will be open, and in fact all of the government offices in the District of Columbia are expected to be open tomorrow. Even though the stock market will remain closed, the president said the U.S. economy will be open for business. And probably one of the more profound statements that I have heard from this president in the 9 months of him being in office. He said they can shake the foundations of our tallest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. The president really saying tonight, Dan, that you can bloody our nose, but we won't go down. You will not knock us down.
Two things rather quickly, John Roberts. There's been, if not a rush to judgment, certainly a quickness of judgment that a consensus seems to be building, if not directly around the president in Washington, that Osama bin Laden, quote, must have been involved with this in some way, end quote. But one has not heard very much talk about Saddam Hussein, who clearly does not wish the United States well. And my question is, have you talked to anybody who's even raised the name of Saddam Hussein? The background of this, of course, being that this administration came into office wanting to not ease up on Saddam Hussein, they said, but to deal with him in some different ways. And I haven't heard very much out of Washington itself tonight, even suggesting that Saddam Hussein could be involved in this in any way. Any of that talk that you've heard anywhere near upper levels?
Well, Dan, certainly nothing that has circulated down to our level at the White House. I mean, if one could be a fly on the wall at the National Security Council briefing that the president had tonight, I'm sure that you would have heard all of the possible combinations and permutations of who, what, and what country might be involved with this. But the only indication that I got tonight, Dan, was that there appeared to be what a senior administration official called, quote, some good information to connect these attacks with Osama bin Laden's group. Though, as some of the guests that you had on earlier this evening suggested, Dan, that the sheer sophistication of this operation involving schedules, loads on aircraft, making sure that they could coordinate the timing, flying just so far to come back so that it could all happen within moments of each other, and not to mention the idea that these terrorists themselves may have been flying the planes, and it takes no small amount of skill to fly a 767 or a 757. I mean, I trained on Cessna 152s, and that takes a lot of concentration. You have to know what you're doing if you're flying one of these aircraft, even if you want to fly it straight and level directly into the ground. So that really speaks to a level of sophistication, Dan, that perhaps you wouldn't be able to get in the camps in Afghanistan, which may suggest some connection to a state, though no one at the White House has mentioned the name of Saddam Hussein tonight.
John Roberts, our chief White House correspondent. Now, we want to go back and try once again to bring you that moment-by-moment recapitulation of how the attack on America unfolded this morning. Here, we hope, is Russ Mitchell's report.
It's early this Tuesday morning, the 11th of September, 2001. It began as a shimmering late summer day.
WCBS News Time, 8:48. It's traffic and weather together. Tom Kaminsky, Chopper 880.
All right, Pat, we are just currently getting a look at the World Trade Center. We have something that has happened here at the World Trade Center.
And within half an hour, became America's second Pearl Harbor.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended.
By now, you've seen the pictures. But it's been a long, agonizing, and confusing 12 hours.
Oh, it was chaos. It's something out of a movie.
So, briefly, here's what we know about exactly what happened. 8:48 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11, hijacked en route from Boston to Los Angeles, slams into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. 2/3 of the way up the 110-story building.
We had seen a fireball, and I can tell you it appears as though something has gone into the World Trade Center.
20 minutes later, at 9:08 a.m., a United Airlines flight, number 175, also from Boston to Los Angeles, tips its wings and crashes into the South Tower.
Oh, my God! Oh, my God!
An incredible fireball, so remarkable, it didn't even seem real.
Looked like a plane rammed into the second building.
35 minutes after that, 9:43 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77, scheduled to fly to Los Angeles from Dulles Airport outside Washington, dives into the Pentagon, destroying one of the building's 5 sides.
I happened to hear a plane come through. It sounded like it was running normal.
10:10 a.m., the 4th hijacked plane, United 93 from Newark to San Francisco, crashes in a remote area 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh.
It just come down like it was going to land, but instead of landing, it just went nose straight into the ground.
In a little more than an hour, 4 horrific plane crashes, hundreds believed dead. But far worse was yet to come. At 10:05 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center, possibly weakened beyond hope by the plane's impact, collapses. People can be seen jumping from the high floors.
The building came just rumbling down. It was like a war zone.
10:28 a.m., and the North Tower, choked with smoke and flames from its upper floors, disintegrates. Smoke and ash from the destruction combined to make parts of New York City look like ancient Pompeii after the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Rescue firemen were coated with thick white dust.
This is terrible. We lost tons of guys. We lost tons of guys.
Cars were under blankets of ash. Rescuers were just happy to be alive. As for the death toll, even tonight there were no hard numbers. But New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani feared it might extend into the thousands. Half a world away, there was a far different reaction. Gunmen appearing to applaud today's terrorism. But Palestine Liberation Organization leader Yasser Arafat did not join in.
We are completely shocked. Completely shocked.
In Afghanistan, a spokesman for the ruling Taliban, who provides sanctuary for terrorist leader Osama bin Laden, said he could not have been behind the attack.
Everybody out! Everybody out!
Back home, it was as if war had been declared.
Ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families.
President Bush spoke to the nation, first briefly in Florida, and later from a military base in Louisiana.
The resolve of our great nation is being tested. But make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test. God bless.
Then, heading to another military base outside Omaha.
The airport's being evacuated. They need to go home.
All international flights into the U.S. were diverted to Canada. The FAA stopped every single commercial airplane flight for the first time ever. And terrorism experts made it a point to remind everyone that tomorrow had been set as a sentencing date for an associate of Osama bin Laden for his role in the 1988 bombing of the American embassy in Tanzania. That sentencing had been set for a federal courthouse near the World Trade Center. As the day ended in New York City, another skyscraper in the World Trade Center complex crumbled. Building number 7, 47 stories high. And tonight, while smoke from the collapse of the Twin Towers still lingered over New York City, most who saw and survived this day still had trouble believing what they saw. The phrase you heard over and over again was, "It seemed just like a movie."
No movie. Russ Mitchell, with his detailed recapitulation of the events of this horrifying but historic day. Now we want to take you back to the west coast of the United States again to CBS's Sandra Hughes at Los Angeles International Airport. Sandra?
Dan, the airlines have set up an emergency shelter for folks who were stranded here at Los Angeles International Airport when their flights were all canceled today. Also, family members of the victims of the United and American Airlines flights are currently undergoing grief counseling at 2 nearby hotels.
There's very little that one can say at a time like this. We simply want to be with them and to comfort them as best we can.
Escorted by police, a few of the grieving families came to the airport, looking, hoping for good news. There was none. Others got the news at home.
Yeah. Well, they called me. I woke up to it. And it was the same. He's taken that flight 100 times. I've taken that flight. I've traveled back there to visit him. And, yeah, I figured it was this flight. I mean, I'm just waiting for the confirmation, but we got it.
During a chaotic few hours, police taped off the United terminal while the LAPD bomb squad members suited up. And at American Airlines, passengers waited for word on when they could take their planned flights.
Just as we were getting on the plane, they said all the flights had been canceled.
Most passengers were turned away, told to call later. International flights were to be diverted to nearby Ontario Airport until it closed too.
No specific information has been provided to us as to when LAX will reopen. We have completed a sweep of all passenger terminals, and everything at this airport and Ontario is secure.
One of the doomed flights was bound for San Francisco, where police put that airport on heightened alert as a precautionary measure. Now, back here in Los Angeles, 178 planes are still grounded, and officials say it's going to take some time just to get that number of airplanes organized before they can get things reopened tomorrow, possibly tomorrow. They're hoping for tomorrow. Of course, they are still waiting for the FAA to give them approval as to when they can reopen the airport. Dan?
Sandra, are you in any position, and are other people reporting Los Angeles, to know whether there's a fairly high state of alert still in effect in and around Los Angeles as a whole?
Well, where we are here at the airport, they had cordoned off an area, but now they are letting people back inside the airport. But every few minutes, Dan, fire trucks, police cars with lights on and sirens going will come past here. So there is some sense of a heightened state of alert. I'm not sure what's going on in the rest of the city, but down here, which has been sort of ground zero in Los Angeles, there does still seem to be a lot of tension.
Sandra Hughes reporting live, as she has been throughout the day and evening, from Los Angeles International Airport. Now, on the international scene, first of all, this point, which we need to italicize. At least one news organization did report from Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, some hours ago, that what the reporter said was a missile attack was underway at Kabul. But that proved to be untrue. Afghanistan's anti-Taliban opposition said it carried out an air and rocket assault, that's what it called, on Kabul airport during this 24-hour period. A raid initially, as I say, reported by one news organization, not this one, to be U.S. retaliation for terror attacks in the USA. Just want to get that squared away, and then report that Afghans, Taliban rulers, this radical, sometimes very violent, Muslim organization that rules most of Afghanistan. The rulers of the Taliban condemned the attacks in the United States, and they rejected suggestions that Osama bin Laden could be behind them. They said that Osama bin Laden had no connection with these attacks, in fact said he couldn't have. However, Osama bin Laden emerges today as one of the top suspects behind the bombings. If there were any doubts left about America's increasing vulnerability to terrorism, they were shattered this morning when 3 hijacked planes crashed into the icons of America's economic and military strength.
And I've ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families and to conduct a full-scale investigation.
Almost immediately, the American intelligence community focused on this man, Osama bin Laden, already wanted for the suicide attack on the USS Cole, which killed 17 sailors off the coast of Yemen, and the 1998 twin bombings of U.S. embassies in East Africa that left more than 200 dead, including 12 Americans. A grand jury indicted Osama bin Laden for the bombings in federal court almost 2 years ago. And this is where U.S. authorities would like to put him. But he remains beyond their grasp, because untouched and at large, safe and protected, Osama bin Laden is thousands of miles away, somewhere inside Afghanistan.
If we hand him over right now, so what would we answer to the people? What did you do with the man?
Why did you hand him over?
Syed Rahmatullah is a senior official with Afghanistan's Taliban government, a militant, radical Islamic regime that fought its way to power and now controls most of the country. They refuse to give up bin Laden, insisting the case against him isn't convincing.
The only thing we see from the United States is stiff demands that the man should be extradited. But if I ask you, I mean the people of the United States, if they were instead of us, would they give the man to a country who has already tried to kill him?
Today, I ordered our armed forces to strike at terrorist-related facilities in Afghanistan and Sudan.
One hit here, and another over there.
2 weeks after the embassy bombings, the United States struck back at bin Laden long distance, dropping cruise missiles on his alleged terrorist training camp in eastern Afghanistan.
I think this is all because of Monica Lewinsky.
The Taliban, who believe President Clinton ordered the strikes to divert attention from a scandalous affair, have never allowed an American camera in to see the damage. Until now.
Still, we cannot believe it, that it was done by a man who was, by a country which was our friend once.
By bombing bin Laden, the U.S. may have unwittingly helped him by so demonizing the man that they've turned him into a local hero.
He's a real hero for us, for the Muslim.
Taliban leaders fear if they throw bin Laden out, the people will throw them out.
If the Taliban were to hand over bin Laden tomorrow, the day after, the Taliban wouldn't exist anymore because people in the country would turn against them.
And so the Taliban dig in their heels.
Well, this is something that's become fairly tiresome because we have presented the full indictment.
Undersecretary of State Thomas Pickering met with Taliban officials just a few weeks ago.
They didn't say we're ready to deliver Osama bin Laden, which is what I wanted to hear.
So Afghanistan continues to provide sanctuary to the man who has publicly vowed to wage a terrorist war against the United States, while symbols of America's power lie in ruins. That report was prepared some time ago. Thomas Pickering of the U.S. State Department did not meet a few weeks ago. It's actually now some months ago that he met with the Taliban. The reason for playing that piece for you, CBS News has had two reporters go to Afghanistan fairly recently, each at separate times, and each spending quite a bit of time inside the country. And while a lot of people may not want to hear this, the Taliban rulers insist that they are misunderstood, that their movement is misunderstood. They say they are peaceful. They repeat almost over and over again, we don't have any evidence. There's no hard evidence that Osama bin Laden has done anything. And they accuse the United States of demonizing Osama bin Laden and trying to demonize the Taliban. That's their story as they tell it. Now, a pretty interesting story by the Boston Herald newspaper this Wednesday, quoting a source that does not identify. The Boston Herald says authorities have seized a car at Logan Airport that contained Arabic language flight training manuals. The source is quoted by the Boston Herald saying 5 Arab men had been identified as suspects, including a trained pilot. At least 2 of those men are reported to have flown to Logan Airport on Tuesday from Portland, Maine. The luggage of one of the men who flew to the airport Tuesday did not make his scheduled connection. The Boston Globe reported that the luggage contained a copy of the Quran, an instructional video on flying commercial airliners, and a fuel consumption calculator. The FBI has refused to comment on these reports. In 1999, the major airlines at Logan and the Port Authority were fined a total of $178,000 for at least 136 security violations over the previous 2 years. Just something that goes in the notebook and to keep in mind for total context and perspective that many U.S. airports were well below the standards when it comes to security, not just Logan Airport in Boston. Now, it's morning in Europe. The people there are waking up and reacting to the terrorism here in the United States. CBS's veteran foreign correspondent Mark Phillips is in London with a report. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning, Dan. Well, if the rest of the world was waking up this morning with a sense of disbelief, that impression won't survive a look at the morning papers here. They've all hit the street, and the headlines couldn't be bigger and more dramatic if war had broken out. In fact, it looks very much like that. The Daily Mail here, apocalypse in New York. The Daily Star is this the end of the world? The usually very spectacular Sun, the day that changed the world. The Sun would normally have pictures of young women on its cover, and the broadsheets, which tend to take a more serious view of events and usually are more understated, are equally spectacular here. This is The Guardian, a declaration of war. They say the Times, the old thunderer, when war came to America, all of these with, as you can see, full-page pictures. The Independent, doomsday in America. War again in America. Very serious headlines in the Daily Telegraph, and the usually extremely understated Financial Times carrying this picture of Manhattan in flames under the headline of Assault on America. All of this, of course, following the comments by political leaders across Europe and across the world expressing sympathy and condolences for America, and also, as in the case of British Prime Minister Tony Blair, expressing a desire, calling the attack not just attack on the United States, but also one on the entire democratic world, and pledging support in the fight against international terrorism. That fight presumably begins today if they can find out where it originated. Significantly, the only international comment that came overnight that was not one of condolence and one of sympathy was from Iraq, which talked about these attacks being the result of what they call the fruits of America's crimes against humanity. That is unique in its criticism of the United States. Every other world leader, as I say, had expressed great support. France, for example, calling it a monstrous act. A few final notes, of course. The markets have opened in the Far East, and they've all opened lower. Tokyo has crossed below the psychological 10,000 mark, is now under 10,000 for the first time in 17 years. There hasn't quite been a run on the dollar, but traders in Singapore are saying that the trading there has been very slow simply because they don't know where to peg it, given the paralysis in the U.S. markets these days. So a very uncertain dawn working its way across the world.
Mark Phillips reporting from our CBS Bureau in London. Now, there's a long list of Atlantic Fleet ships now underway to go to support of defense and humanitarian efforts in New York and Washington, D.C. All of these ships are part, well, I shouldn't say definitely all, but all or most of them are part of one or of two aircraft carrier groups, the USS George Washington Aircraft Carrier Group and the USS John F. Kennedy. Now, those carrier groups are moving to New York and Washington, D.C. To be of whatever humanitarian and defense help they can be. We have a listing of the ships, but it takes a while to give them. If we had an opportunity, we'll pass that along to you a little later on. The effects of the attack here in New York are being felt far and wide across this country. Cynthia Bowers has part of that story from Chicago.
Dan, as news of this catastrophic attack spread here in the Chicago area, so did the sense no place is secure.
I was scared. I was very scared.
Within minutes of the first reports, nearly 20,000 people poured out of the Sears Tower, the nation's tallest building, afraid it too was a target.
I would say a sense of anxiety, of nervousness, and people were anxious to leave the building.
Evacuations were ordered in the famed Chicago Loop, including the Board of Trade.
Everyone's concerned. You could see the look on their face.
One by one, federal buildings, museums, and colleges closed down. Extra trains were put on the tracks to get hundreds of thousands of people out of the downtown center, under the watchful eyes of military jets, with hundreds of police on the streets below.
Every sworn personnel in the Chicago Police Department, from the superintendent on down, will remain in uniform until further notice.
Security is so tight across the Midwest, passengers on this Delta jet in Cleveland were evacuated, while authorities made sure a threatened bomb was not on board. As business ground to a halt in Cleveland, workers heading home clogged roadways. Landmarks like the Arch in St. Louis were emptied.
I just felt like better than sitting home watching that, and this help me feel like I'm doing something.
And blood banks began to fill as the enormity of this catastrophe started to hit home.
I think we need to pray for our country and pray for our president, because, you know, this is the national crisis that people have been talking about for years.
With Americans feeling so vulnerable, officials here and everywhere are walking a fine line between taking the necessary precautions without creating additional panic. Cynthia Bowers, CBS News, Chicago.
Cynthia Bowers. By far the most deadly and devastating attacks occurred at one of America's most famous landmarks, New York City's World Trade Center. This morning, it became ground zero. 60 Minutes 2 correspondent Scott Pelley has that story.